A man came up our lane last Tuesday, 62 years old, from the city, asking if I would look him over the old way, the way folks here still trust more than a doctor's clipboard.
I noticed things about him before he said a word, a puffiness in his hands and face that had not been there last visit, a thirst he mentioned 3 times in an hour, and a tightness in his joints that made him wince climbing down from his own truck.
He told me he had been a powder. He mixed it in water every morning. It was sold to him with a promise of muscle. A 60-year-old body has no business chasing back so fast.
I am not a doctor, and I want to be straight with you. I am not going to tell you a supplement is good or bad. That is a matter between a man and his own physician.
What I will show you is other plain observation, nothing more, the same way I would notice a horse favoring a leg before anybody told me what was wrong.
My family has watched over neighbors this same plain way since we settled Lancaster County in 1838, watching close, saying little, and I will walk you through what I noticed, step by step.
Here is something worth saying plain. This man's name was Mark, and Mark is not a foolish man. He did what he thought was careful before he ever bought that tub of powder.
What nobody told Mark, not the fellow at the store, not the bright label on the container, was the plain, unglamorous part that matters more than the muscle promise ever could.
A body past 60 does not run the same as a body at 25. It needs more water than it used to, it recovers slower, and it will tell you when something is off in small ways, a puffiness here, a stiffness there, long before it shouts.
The supplement industry sells the exciting half of the story. Stronger arms, quicker gains, a body that feels young again.
It rarely spends a breath on the plain, boring half, the part about water, rest, and patience, because that half does not sell a second tub before the first one is empty. Nobody puts 8 extra glasses of water a day on a label because there is no profit sitting inside a glass of tap water, and a company selling excitement has little reason to hand you the plain, unglamorous truth for free.
The first thing I noticed was a puffiness in Mark's hands and around his eyes. Nothing alarming, but plain enough for an old farmer to spot.
That kind of muscle powder pulls water into the muscle itself, which is much of how it works in the first place, drawing water in to help the muscle hold more than it did before.
That pull on water is not a secret or a danger by itself. It simply means the body now needs more water coming in than it used to. Same as a wagon carrying a heavier load needs a stronger team pulling it. Mark had not changed how much he drank at all. He was asking his body to hold more water in one place while giving it no more water overall. And a body handles that imbalance by showing it plainly on the face and in the hands, right where an old farmer's eye would catch it first. It is not a complicated thing to understand once somebody explains it plain, but nobody had ever taken the time to explain it to Mark at all.
I asked Mark straight out how much water he was drinking most days, and he thought on it a moment before admitting it was probably no more than it had ever been. A cup of coffee, a glass at supper, maybe a bottle of something on a hot afternoon.
He had read plenty about the powder itself, but nothing at all about what his body would need alongside it, and when I pointed that out, he seemed almost embarrassed, the way a man is when a simple oversight gets named plain in front of him. I told him what I tell any neighbor whose face looks fuller than it should. Drink more, plain water, steady through the day, not all at once.
It is not complicated advice, and it is not mine to claim as some secret. It is simply the part that gets left off the label, because a bottle of water does not need marketing to convince a man to buy it. It is already sitting free from his own kitchen tap. The second thing I noticed was how often Mark mentioned being thirsty, 3 separate times inside an hour, more than a man usually speaks of it unless his body is asking hard. An older body does not send clear signals the way a younger one does. A young man feels thirsty and drinks right then.
An older body's thirst signal grows quieter with age. So by the time Mark felt thirsty enough to mention it out loud, his body had likely been asking for some while already, just quiet about it.
This is a plain fact of growing older. that few doctors ever mention outright because it sounds like such a small thing, and yet it explains more tired afternoons and aching joints than most folks ever trace back to it. Add a supplement pulling extra water into the muscles, and that quiet request turns into something loud enough that even a man who does not usually notice such things starts commenting on it 3 times before lunch.
Esther brought Mark a full pitcher of water while we sat and talked, more than he would have poured for himself, and by the time he left that afternoon, the pitcher was near empty. He remarked, almost surprised at himself, that he could not recall drinking that much water at one sitting in years.
I told him that was likely closer to what his body actually needed all along, supplement or no supplement, and that most folks his age walk around a little dried out without ever noticing, simply because thirst does not announce itself the way it once did. The powder had not created a new problem. It had simply turned up the volume on one that was already quietly there.
Now, before I go further, there is something I have to say plainly, because leaving it out would do Mark and anyone watching a disservice. A man past 60 who is taking any supplement, creatine or otherwise, ought to be telling his own doctor about it, especially if he carries any trouble with his kidneys, his heart, or takes regular medication. This is not a small point tucked in at the end for legal comfort.
Water and muscle powders both put real demand on how the kidneys work, and an older body sometimes carries conditions a man does not even know he has yet. What I noticed in Mark was plain, and by his own doctor's word later, nothing serious. But plain observation from an old farmer is not the same as a checkup, and I told Mark so myself before he ever left our porch that day.
The third thing I noticed was how carefully Mark climbed down from his truck, favoring his knees, wincing slightly. The same wince I have seen in horses before a limp shows itself plain. Joints depend on fluid moving freely through them, same as a hinge depends on a little oil to swing loose instead of catching.
A body running a bit short on water does not lubricate its joints as well as one drinking properly, and a man pushing himself harder in the gym, chasing muscle a supplement promised him, puts more demand on those same joints while giving them less of what they need to move easy.
It was not one single cause I could point to plainly. It looked to my eye like 2 things stacking on top of each other, more strain and less water, meeting at the knees, the same way 2 small problems on a farm often meet at the weakest point of the whole operation, rather than showing up separately. Mark admitted he had taken up lifting heavier than he had in 20 years, eager once the powder had him feeling capable of it again, pushing 3, sometimes 4 days a week, without much rest between, chasing the strength he remembered from decades earlier, without pausing to consider that his body had aged those same decades right alongside his memory of it. I asked him plain if his knees had ever felt this way before he started, and he said no, not in years. I did not tell him to stop lifting. That was never mine to say. I told him what my own father told me about working a tired horse. Rest between the hard days. Water before you ask for the effort, not after, and let the body recover as seriously as you push it. Mark wrote that down on a scrap of paper before he left, which told me he had heard it, really heard it, not just nodded along the way folks sometimes do out of politeness. The fourth thing I noticed had nothing to do with his body and everything to do with his manner. Mark spoke about wanting his strength back the way a young man speaks about wanting something by Friday, impatient, chasing a calendar instead of his own body's pace. That rush is not Mark's fault alone. Everything sold to him promised speed. Before and after pictures inside 30 days, a tub of powder with a timeline printed right on the label, a whole industry built around the idea that a man should see dramatic change fast or feel he wasted his money. An old body does not care much for timelines. It rebuilds slow, the same way a barn raised in a single afternoon still needs its joints to settle and its wood to season before it can be trusted to hold real weight. Mark was asking 62 years of wear to move at the pace of a 20-year-old's patience, and that mismatch showed up plain in how hard, how fast, and how often he was pushing himself.
I told Mark about my own Uncle Amos, who took up chopping wood again at 68 after years away from it, and who built his stamina back over an entire winter, not a month. A little more each week, never in a rush,
never chasing a date on a calendar, content to be a little stronger this month than he was last month, and no more impatient than that.
Amos used to say, a body rebuilt slow stays built, while a body rushed falls apart just as fast as it was thrown together. Mark sat quiet a moment after I told him that, and admitted he had been chasing 30 days like the label suggested, rather than the season or two his own body likely needed to catch up to what his mind was already asking of it. That single shift in thinking, from a deadline to a season, seemed to settle something in him, right there on the porch. The same kind of quiet settling I have seen in a man's face when he finally stops fighting something he cannot win by force alone.
The fifth thing worth telling you is simple, and it is not a remedy so much as plain old habits worth returning to. More water through the day, steady rather than all at once, sipped through the morning instead of gulped down in a rush before noon. A slower pace in the gym, with real rest between hard days instead of pushing through all of them like a man half his age might. Real food alongside whatever supplement a man chooses, since a powder was never meant to replace a full plate of honest food. Eggs, meat, vegetables, the kind of eating that built strong bodies long before any tub of powder existed.
And patience measured in seasons, not calendar days printed on a label by somebody who has never met you or your body. None of this contradicts what any doctor would tell a man his age. It simply puts the plain, boring half of the story back where the exciting half had crowded it out.
Mark came back to visit 6 weeks later, and the puffiness in his hands and face was gone, plain to see the moment he stepped down from his truck without a single wince this time. He told me he had done exactly what we talked about: more water, slower pace, real meals, and patience with a body he had been rushing without meaning to. He still took his powder most mornings, same as before. That choice was always his and his doctor's to make, not mine. What had changed was everything sitting around that choice. The water, the rest, the pace, the patience, and that was plenty to change how his whole body carried itself.
So here is what I noticed, laid out plain. A puffiness that came from more water pulled into the muscle without more water coming in to match it. A thirst that ran quieter than it should have until a supplement turned the volume up loud enough to notice.
A tightness in the joints from strain and dryness stacking together. A rush toward results that a body past 60 was never built to match. And underneath all of it, a set of plain old habits, patient and unhurried, that settled every one of those signs back down once Mark returned to them. None of this says a supplement is good or bad for any man reading this. It only says the body will tell you plainly what it needs, if you are willing to sit quiet and notice, the same way an old farmer learns to notice a horse before it ever fully limps.
I am not a doctor, and nothing here should be taken as medical advice about creatine or your body's needs.
Especially if you carry a health condition or take medication regularly. That conversation belongs between you and your own physician, plain and simple.
What I can tell you is what an old farmer noticed on his own porch with his own eyes, watching a good man's body speak in the quiet way bodies do. If this kind of plain, careful observation is something you find useful, stay a while longer here on the channel. We look at things this same close, unhurried way often. Until next time, listen close to what your own body is telling you. It rarely shouts before it has already been asking quietly for some time.